The sun was leaning toward the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the bustling floor of Longacre Security. Inside the counting room, the steady click of sorting machines mixed with the rustle of currency. Ralph Olcott sat at his desk, his fingers moving over a stack of ledger sheets while Ralph, a senior clerk, stretched his arms with a heavy sigh. Ralph looked over at his coworker and said that as soon as this was tallied, they had another pickup to make at the sports arena. Ralph, keeping his eyes firmly on the columns of numbers, replied that he kept his mind on business. He added that if those figures did not jive, Mr. Dyer was going to keep them all there until midnight. Ralph chuckled, stretching his legs, and remarked that he guessed he would like a cup of coffee. At that moment, young Kathy looked up from her desk with a bright smile, reminding him not to be late tonight because her mother had invited the Wilsons over. Ralph smiled warmly at his daughter, telling her to inform her mother that he would be there by 7 o'clock. With a wave, he said his bye-byes and stepped out into the hallway. Along the corridor, he crossed paths with Linda, who greeted him cheerfully. Ralph, still slightly weary from the numbers, mistakenly called her Miss Longacre and asked how she was doing. She laughed softly, correcting him, and asked how it was going, calling him Robert. Ralph smiled sheepishly, mentioning that his name was actually Ralph. Back in the break room, the atmosphere was lighter. Another employee noticed Ralph taking a breather and joked that he was taking a break. Ralph nodded, admitting that a person could get a little punchy in there sometimes. The other employee nodded sagely, calling it industrial fatigue, something he had read about in a magazine, warning that a person had to be careful of that. Ralph found the term amusing and repeated it with a smile. The employee continued, expressing that the way he saw it, counting money all day long was like tightening the same bolt on an assembly line, and that such monotony could crack a guy up. He suggested that maybe Ralph ought to talk to the boss about getting more vacation time for everyone. Ralph agreed it was time to get back to work, saying, "Let us go." Suddenly, the peaceful routine was shattered. Two men wearing masks burst through the fire door, their movements sharp and threatening. One of them shouted for everyone to freeze, commanding them to get on their feet and put their hands on top of their heads. He pointed a weapon, ordering someone to come open the door, then snarled at another to use their other hand. He told a frightened clerk to back up and ordered Ralph to fill up a large canvas bag with the money bags. Amidst the tension, Ralph thought of his daughter, whispering that he had to get a cup of coffee for Kathy. Seeing an opportunity as the intruders grew distracted, Ralph lunged toward the wall and hit the silent alarm. The main robber realized what had happened and shouted that it was a silent alarm, telling his partner that they needed to get out of there. He warned that if anybody made a move after them, they would be dead. His partner, lagging behind, yelled for him to wait. In the ensuing scramble near the exit, the primary robber turned on his slower partner, declaring that there was a little change of plans and that he was going to get his cup right now. A shot echoed, and the masked man collapsed as the leader fled into the night. Moments later, the security team rushed in. Mr. Longacre looked at the scene in shock, asking Ralph what had happened. Ralph, breathless and trembling, told him to call the police. Joe Montgomery, the chief of security, arrived quickly and stated that one of his men was already doing it. Joe knelt by the fallen robber, noting that there were two of them and that it looked like Ralph had stopped this one. He checked the discarded bag, announcing that the money was all there. Mr. Longacre looked at Ralph with profound admiration, remarking that Ralph had taken a terrible chance by going after an armed man. Ralph, still dazed by the adrenaline, asked if he meant that he had actually done this. Joe smiled proudly, confirming that Ralph surely did and that Ralph was a real hero. Later that afternoon, Joe Montgomery sat in the private office of his old friend, Barnaby Jones. Joe looked deeply worried, explaining that as chief of security for Longacre, it was his job that was on the line. He explained to Barnaby that while the company was off the hook because the robbery failed and the money was recovered, the only one who was going to wind up holding the bag was himself. Barnaby, sitting back with a calm demeanor, comforted his friend, saying that in the 30 years they had known each other, he had never heard of anyone questioning Joe's integrity. Joe sighed, clarifying that he did not think it was a matter of integrity that Longacre was questioning, but rather his competence. Barnaby asked about the police and whether they believed it was an inside job. Joe replied that they had not officially labeled it as such, but since his security people were the only ones supposed to have the key cards that would open that specific fire door, he could not blame them for thinking so. Barnaby asked if Joe stood behind his people. Joe answered with absolute certainty, stating that the Federal Bureau of Investigation could not have done a better job of screening them than he did. He declared they were clean and that he would stake his career on any one of them, realizing with a heavy heart that he already had. Barnaby inquired if Joe had accounted for all the key cards that were issued. Joe explained that they were signed out when a man came on duty and signed in when they went off. Barnaby pointed out that, nevertheless, it would be a simple matter for somebody to slip one out during the day and get a duplicate made. Joe admitted that was a possibility and expressed his hope that Barnaby could dig up some information pointing away from any of his men. Barnaby asked if Mr. Longacre would mind having a private detective snooping around. Joe confessed that, frankly, he would, but he did not want his board of directors wagging their fingers at him in case it turned out that everybody but Joe had been on the wrong track. Joe looked earnestly at his friend, asking if he would look into it. Barnaby smiled gently, telling Joe that he already knew the answer to that, promising to give him a call later. At the Grand Longacre estate, the afternoon sun sparkled on the swimming pool. Inside the house, the intercom buzzed. Mr. Longacre answered, and the voice of Ralph Alcott came through, announcing his arrival and mentioning that he had been invited over this afternoon. Mr. Longacre warmly told him to drive on up. Out in the driveway, Ralph's modest car had come to a sputtering halt, thick white steam billowing from under the hood. Chris Longacre, the lovely daughter of the owner, walked over and asked if it was on fire. Ralph stepped out, embarrassed, explaining that it was just one of those hoses, probably the radiator too. Chris laughed lightly, joking that he looked like Old Faithful there for a minute, and invited him to come on inside, saying they would take care of it later. She called out to her father, pointing out Ralph. Mr. Longacre stepped forward, introducing Ralph to his wife, Nora. Ralph shook her hand, expressing that he was very pleased to meet her. Nora smiled warmly, telling Ralph she had been looking forward to it and betting he had seen all the newspapers filled with stories about one man's courage. She remarked that it would be nice if they could make a serum out of it and give a shot to everybody in the country. Mr. Longacre agreed with a smile, prompting Chris to ask her father if he was going to tell Ralph the big news. Mr. Longacre laughed, asking for a chance to speak. He turned to Ralph, explaining that as Ralph probably knew, there had been an opening for some time now for a new assistant to the chief accountant. He proudly announced that the job was Ralph's, as he was promoting him for what he did. Chris beamed, but Ralph looked overwhelmed, asking them to wait a minute. Nora joked that this was the trouble with women, as they would never let a man tell a punchline. Chris teased her father, saying she would be erasing it for him too, and noted that at least she got that in. She looked at Ralph, adding that whatever the salary was, she was sure he was still being underpaid. Ralph, humbled, murmured that he really did not expect such a reward. Mr. Longacre offered a word to the wise, advising Ralph never to give him a chance to change his mind. Nora laughed, saying they were always ganging up on him, and Chris suggested that maybe Ralph would like a drink before lunch. Ralph looked back at his smoking vehicle, mentioning that he had better do something about his car. Chris told him not to worry, asking her father if he could have someone take care of Ralph's car. Mr. Longacre agreed immediately, noting that Andy was coming over from the motor pool and could fix Ralph's car just as well as his own. Chris then brightly asked Ralph how about some tennis after lunch. Meanwhile, Barnaby Jones was deep in his investigation at the police station, reviewing the file of the deceased robber. The man's name was Leo Gully, originally out of Boston. The record showed he had been released 6 weeks ago from a Massachusetts state penitentiary for charges including robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and grand theft auto. Barnaby looked over the extensive document, wondering aloud if it was a rap sheet or a portfolio. He remarked that it sounded like Gully came west looking for greener pastures. He inquired about the man who got away. The official report indicated that a witness from across the street said she saw him jump into the back seat of a car and take off, but she was too far away to get a license plate number. Barnaby pondered the detail of the back seat, noting that if there was a driver, it meant there were at least 4 individuals involved in the scheme. He reasoned that this total would terminate at 3 if they did not count an inside accomplice. His associate asked how he figured 4, and if he suspected an inside man. Barnaby stated it was probably somebody on the security force. His associate urged caution, warning him not to back himself into a corner because Joe Montgomery was their friend too. Barnaby agreed. He did not want to seem hurtful, but maintained there was no way those 2 could have gotten into that secure facility without some inside help. He added that he was inclined to agree, but he was also remembering there are a lot of other people working in that building besides Joe's security force. The associate countered that only the security personnel were issued key cards. Barnaby acknowledged this, promising to give a call if he discovered anything new. He reflected on how an ex-convict only 6 weeks out of the Massachusetts slammer could connect so fast with such heavyweights. He appreciated that his associate had been paying attention and wondered how to figure it out. Since he was not clairvoyant, Barnaby decided he would have to go to the streets for information. He knew the right direction but noted the informant he was thinking of was notoriously hard to find, fondly remembering his old friend known as the Professor. Later that evening, the silver moonlight bathed the quiet neighborhood where Linda lived. Ralph had driven her home in a borrowed vehicle. As they sat in the car, Linda laughed as she recounted a story about how Pete told Lois she had better stick her head out of that ivory tower of hers and see what was going on in the world, and how one should have heard what Lois said in response. Ralph smiled, pulling up to a modest apartment building. Linda pointed out her place right over there, joking that was loaded with charm and peeling stucco. Ralph looked up and remarked that from here, all he could see was the charm. Linda smiled playfully, admitting that inside it was even worse. She teased that she would ask him in, but noted it had been a long day. She suggested they had better take a night. Ralph agreed, realization dawning on him that they had just met recently. Linda affirmed this, but confessed she had been noticing him for a long time. Ralph asked where he was during all that time. Linda giggled, saying he was busy not noticing her and calling her Robert. Ralph apologized profusely, but Linda told him not to be, because she actually liked the name